Hi. Oh, thank you. I missed you guys. We did too. We missed you guys a lot. Yeah, okay. So a lot of people, many people come up to me going, hey, how's your sabbatical? I go, it wasn't a sabbatical, it was a vacation. Okay. Sabbatical involves quite a bit longer, actually. So it was good. In essence, we just needed some time to disconnect, right? To be nobodies and normal. And you guys, I'm sure a lot of you have probably sometimes worked so long and so hard, you're just like, when you stop, you're just kind of stare at a wall for a while, right? And I'm not talking just for a few hours. I'm talking for days, right? Just going, oh, what just happened? So, thank you for all your prayers and your well-wishing. And so, when I left, we were going through the book of Ephesians. And we got to Ephesians chapter 4. And I wanted to pause there for a while and kind of expand on Ephesians chapter 4, which I'm going to do some more. Ephesians chapter 4, I was here in chapter 4, verse 11. God himself gave some to be apostles, some as prophets, some as proclaimers of the good news or evangelists, and some as shepherds or pastors, it would say, but it's not pastors. The word here is shepherds. It means it's the word for shepherd, but it usually is translated as priest. Okay, some as shepherds, and obviously it's not a shepherd in a field with actual sheep that God has appointed for the body of Messiah. He's talking about, right, rabbis, pastors, that type, priests. Some as shepherds and some as teachers. And what's their reason? To equip the kedoshim, the holy ones, believers, to equip believers for the work of service for building up the body of Messiah. Wait. Work of service. You mean there's something that God has us all to do? We don't just come here and have a good time and enjoy? Oh, that's part of it, right? But we also have work to do, okay? So the work of service for building up the body of Messiah, this will continue until we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the sons of God, to mature adulthood, to the measure of the stature of Messiah's fullness. So has that happened yet? That means it's ongoing, right? I think we're going to be doing this until Messiah returns, okay? As a result, we are no longer to be like children tossed around by the waves and blown all over by every wind of teaching, by the trickery of men and with cunning and deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all ways into Messiah, who is the head. From him, the whole body is fitted and held together by every supporting ligament. The proper working of each individual part produces the body's growth for building itself up in love. And you could take these verses and go over to back to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 13, and 14, and it expounds on that even more. Okay, but we're not going to do that today. Where I went, and I started before we went on vacation, is I started talking about the fivefold ministry in brief. Okay, but as I was thinking about that, to continue teaching that here, I felt God leading me to back up a little bit and talk about something very rudimentary again, for a purpose. I know most of you are probably like, oh, that's really rudimentary. But I sense God saying it's very important, and to rehash it, to go over it again. But here's something I wanted to cover. You know, the Torah portion this week in chapter 32 of and onward, 33 and so forth, in the Torah portion is Parashat Vayishlach. This is the portion where Jacob is after. You remember Jacob? You guys know who Jacob was? Remember? Jacob and Esau? Remember, twins in the womb? And he said there were two nations battling each other, even in the womb. And even as they were delivered, they were born, they were fighting each other, right? One was wanting to come out first, and they were fighting each other, and Esau came first. And what's interesting, doing some studies on this, and how does it pertain to what I'm going to talk about? So, you know, if you go through the book of Ephesians, Everybody focuses on Ephesians chapter 6 about, we battle not against flesh and blood, right? It's about warfare. And so really the whole book is a setup for what Paul is saying towards the end. And it's all important. But here, if you go all the way back to Jacob and Esau, and you really study where God says, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, right? And I'm not going to go into all the details of that portion, just a little tidbits where when it says Esau was a mighty hunter before the Lord, which is a phrase in Hebrew that God actually used previously in the book of Genesis for Nimrod, the one who built the Tower of Babel. Now Nimrod, he also had another name. He was named Amraphel, and he was a contemporary of Abraham. Nimrod was the king of Babylon. He was a high sorcerer. He worshipped and served the enemy in a profound, deep way. And he married his own mother, incestuous relationship. This is how evil and perverse it was. Remember the Nephilim, the giants that were from the union of fallen angels and human women pre-flood, and God wiped out the earth. And part of it was for that reason, right? And the corruption that came from that to humanity. Well, you have Nephilim on the earth later in David's time, right? The Philistines and the Goliath and all that. How did that happen? But God destroyed them, right? Well, when you start studying deep enough, John and I studied this for years, it kind of started back up with Babylon and the Tower of Babel and Nimrod and all that. In other words, he got so dark and evil that he started perpetrating the same kind of thing, right? Interacting with fallen angels, right? Human women and producing offspring, okay? The giants. And that's where they started back again, okay? But what's interesting is this, is when Scripture talks about Nimrod, it says he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Exactly in Hebrew, that's used for Esau. And in Hebrew, John and I would always be astounded at this phrase, the English interpretation of it. Because in Hebrew, it's a Gabor Zaid. And if you were to interpret it correctly within its context, it would be a devil tyrant in God's face. So how you get a mighty hunter before the Lord, it sounds almost heroic, right? To an evil scumbag murderer in God's face, you're like, that's vastly different. How do you get that, right? Big difference. So, now wait a second. So Esau, who is the firstborn son of who? Isaac, okay? His brother's Jacob. He's a evil devil tyrant in God's face. He's a murderer, right? What's going on? And if you track him very carefully, not just the one story where he and Jacob are fighting over the birthright, right? Is you find out, those Nephilim I was talking about? They had Nephilim tribes at that time in the promised land. And Esau married into those tribes. Remember, his father was upset because he kept wanting to marry a righteous woman from certain tribes that were godly. But he refused, and he had multiple wives from the enemy side of things. Okay? Now, do you realize, John and I have done these studies for years, and even in our books, that the Edomites are the descendants of Esau and those Nephilim tribes. And the modern-day Arabs today, they're not Ishmael. There are some, the Bedouin, who are from Ishmael. The modern-day Arabs, most of them today, right? I'm not clumping everybody in, but generally speaking, the Edomites, the Palestinians and such, are descended from Edom, from Esau. Okay? They're mixed. I'm not saying they're all evil, you understand? But what was happening? There was a war between God's people and the enemies, right? There's a war of nations, and that still goes on today in the world and still affects the whole world, okay? This is not a light thing that we just read about as a history, right? And so why am I talking about this? Because when Jacob fled, because his father was going to give the blessing of the firstborn, which is the double portion, to Esau, it was actually supposed to go to Jacob. Do you know why? Because Jacob was fulfilling all the duties and responsibilities of the firstborn, while Esau was neglecting all of that and feeding, right? Feeding his own appetites. And also dad's appetite. If you read it carefully, it says, Isaac had a certain appetite for a certain type of food, and Esau kept fulfilling that, going out hunting, right, and killing. And when he comes back in the camp, and he says to his younger brother, right, feed me stew. See, here was how it worked in the cultures back then. The firstborn son was to stay in the camp and manage and care for the father's estate. He was to take care of the camp stew to feed everyone. That was the duties of the firstborn. But instead, Esau, the firstborn, was going out having fun, enjoying himself, while Jacob was taking on all the responsibilities of the firstborn, not just the stew, but everything else. You know, it says he was a man of the tents. That's the English version. That's not what it says. In Hebrew, it's the same verbiage that's used to describe Noah. It says he was I forgot how the word goes, but it's the word tov, tamim. That's the word in Hebrew. It's tamim. And the word means, it doesn't mean man of the tents. In some versions in English, it'll say he was a plain man, right, concerning Jacob. For Noah, the word is tamim, and it means a straight, upright man of integrity. That's the same exact word they used for Jacob, but the English, they changed it for Jacob and said he was a man of the tents or a plain man. Why would, it's the same exact word. He was an upright man of integrity. And everybody's, well, you know, you get this image of Jacob being this little scrawny, mealy mouse, conniving kid, right? But that's far from the truth. Remember, they were twins. So they were both, and Esau was very manly, strong. Jacob was strong too. When you read through and you realize when Jacob fled after he got the blessing by trickery, remember? His mother said, hey, you better go in. Dad's about ready to give the blessing to Esau. He's not supposed to. It should go to you, right? And why is this a big deal? Why couldn't he just go, hey, so what? Just change your mind. See, remember, in ancient times, they didn't typically, this far back, they did eventually, they didn't have written contracts. They were, once you laid hands on someone and proclaimed something, you made a covenant, that was it, done deal. It's as good as a contract, okay? A written legal contract that we have today, okay? So if he did that, it was binding. There's no taking it back. And so she had Jacob come in and, right, through, hey, disguise yourself as your brother, go in and trick him. Because remember, Isaac he was blind by this point. And I think the blindness was not just physical. I think it was also a spiritual blindness that was going on. So he blessed Jacob, thinking it was Esau with the firstborn, which was not ever supposed to be done in secret. It was always supposed to be done in front of everyone. The reason he was going to do it in secret for Esau, in other words, Isaac knew it was wrong, was so nobody would know, so he could get away with it. It wasn't supposed to be. So you don't read this in the text when it's talking plainly. You have to know the culture and the history. So what happens? Esau comes in after, and he's like, okay, Dad, I'm ready for my blessing. He's like, what are you talking about? I just blessed you. He goes, no, you didn't. What? And he freaks out, right? He loses it. That's it. I have no blessing, right? And I always used to think, just change your mind and go, oops, sorry, wrong kid, right? No, it's legal and binding. It's already done. What does Jacob do? I'm out. See you later. Esau's going to kill me. He runs, right? But then he runs, and the first night out, he gets a rock and puts his head on it, and he sleeps at this place. Remember? And what does he see in a dream? God speaks to him. And he sees a stairway from heaven to earth, right? And he sees angels coming to and fro. And what does God say? You know where he's at? He's on Mount Moriah, where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. You understand? That's where the temple was to be built. And he says, surely this is the house of the Lord. And it is. That's where heaven and earth, if you will, the veil, the parochot, is finished there in all the world. You understand? There's a reason why God said, yeah, because that's where my throne is in heaven. And it's supposed to be here on earth too. You understand? It's a big deal. Hands going up. Let's get the microphone. Where's the microphone? Right up here, up front.
There's so much deceit in all this that's going on.
Yes.
And God always tells us we're not supposed to. We're supposed to wait on Him.
Right.
And I've always had a problem with that whole little story of Sarai and Abram and all that went down if he had only waited. And so this is just going on with the story with more of that. And it just seems like God
kind of rubs you the wrong way, like David killing, having another man killed and having adultery, and why didn't God spare him and all that kind of stuff.
And God has it in there for all of us because we do the same thing.
We absolutely do.
But it just, I think if it would,
don't you expect your patriarchs to be more holy and righteous?
I would have thought
through?
so.
Right, you'd think so. But see, that's something John and I talk about too that I love is, Scripture includes this stuff. If it was all about looking good, we'd cut that part out, wouldn't we? No, we are being true to what actually happened, even when it shows all our problems and faults when we record it, because it's important that we get the truth, right? And this is how it actually was. God takes very flawed individuals and He works with us and with them, okay? But He works with us, very flawed. That's not an excuse for our flaws. Oh, Jacob did it, so I can do it, right? No, because there's a reason for this. See, Abraham had some flaws. God still did great things for him. He made a promise. Why? Because Abraham, when you do the studies on who he was, stood up for God in a pagan culture. He had no reason to. God called him his friend, and He says, he had faith in me, he trusted me, and it was accredited to him as righteousness. Okay? Isaac, he had some problems, but he offered himself to death for God's sake, right? Now we come to Jacob. There's whole studies on this. I wish I could go into it at this time, but I can't. But here's what's interesting. Jacob starts off this way. Kind of sounds like Joseph later on, right? The favored son that Jacob loves. God gives him this promise and this vision. Hey, look, your brothers are going to bow to you. So what does he do? Hey, I'm Dad's favorite. So he comes to the brothers and goes, hey, I had a dream that you're all going to bow to me. They're like, that's it. Let's kill him. Right? And now all the flaws of everybody comes out, right? But God is like, oh, great, I can work with that. Let's make some godly stories. Think about it. That's what He does. So Jacob runs off, right? And he comes to a well, right? And he takes the lid off this well, which usually took several men to remove. So is Jacob a scrawny little mealy mouse guy? No, he's a big manly guy because he's like, here, I'll get that for you. Bang! Right? He is not a scrawny kid. He's a man, and he's very strong. Okay? Just like his brother. They're twins. Now, obviously, one's all hairy, and the other one is not. Okay, so there's some differences physically. But here's the interesting thing. You go into the story, what happens? He's looking for a wife. And by the way, he only wanted one. Right? And he runs into some deceit as well. Right? And even the name Yaakov, which means heel catcher. I found this interesting studies with the rabbis where they go, look, when it talks about Esau, it says the mother and father, they both named Esau because he's red and hairy. Okay? But when it came to Jacob, mom named Jacob heel catcher because he was hanging on to Esau's heel. And a heel catcher is actually a positive term, not a negative. See, a heel catcher, Yaakov, it means to grab onto the heel of your enemy and not let them go when they try to get away with it, something. You grab on and you fight to the death. Okay? Now that's got to come into play with Jacob because he goes away, right, by trickery. But he's introduced to some deeper trickery that takes him 14 years to get through, right? And then he walks away with 2 wives and 2 concubines. and a whole bunch of children, okay, and a whole bunch of wealth, right? Sheep and servants and everything. Goes away with nothing. And God made a promise to him there at Mount Moriah. Said, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to multiply you and your offspring. But the same exact promise he was given to Abraham and on. It's continuing. And here we are in chapter 32 in this portion. And this is the part where Jacob finally, after all this time, funny, the time is like 14 years. 14 is what? 2 sevens. 7 is Hebrew for perfection and completion, times 2. Is Jacob the same man returning as he was who left? No. He's not a deceiver anymore. He's learned a lot. And what most people don't understand, the boy who left is not the same man who returns. That man is no longer one of trickery. He goes at things directly face to face. Okay? And he realizes, hey, the word's gone. Esau knows you're coming back, and it's been 14. He's coming back with 400 men armed to greet you. Ah! You know what he's thinking? Oh, I'm dead. Okay? But he goes ahead, but he does some smart things. He's been learning wisdom. But all this time, the man who comes back is someone who's conquered his own issues. He really has. When you read about it, he's completely different. Because no more, he could have done some trickery. He could have gone all the way around Esau and gone around him and never, right? If you do the studies on the map, there are lots of places he could have gone to avoid this. But instead, he went straight through, and he knew Esau's coming, and he splits up his camp. It's so big now. He goes, all right, take one wife and half the kids this way, one half the other this way. That way, if he attacks, not everybody's killed. One will get away, but I'll be there to face it, whichever one. And then he goes, and as we're going up, he goes, I'm going to send some gifts to him first. They'll come before me with these servants. Hey, here, your brother's behind us. He's coming. Here's what he offered to you. And he does 3 times. He does this. Send the gifts, and I'm coming. And then he gets to a river that he has to ford, okay? And he sends the wife and kids across and all that's left. And he goes, I'm staying on this side for the night. And that's where we're at. And he stays on that side. No longer is this a man who runs away. He's living up to his name finally. And it says this. So they cross over the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and he sent across whatever he had. So Jacob remained all by himself. Then a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. Talk about where's that coming from? So he's there at night, and all of a sudden a man shows up, and hey, let's wrestle? Or does he jump him? How does that work? Right? He wrestled with him until the break of dawn. Now, okay, it's dark out. Hey, guys, you ever wrestled before? Raise your hand. You ever wrestled like several 8, 9 hours? That's some wrestling, right? 15 minutes, you're like, okay,